Good afternoon, dear friends. All that has stolen all kinds of time from my lecture. But that's the first time I think one of my children has ever introduced me to speak on a theological subject. So thank you, Miriam, and thank you, my dear wife, for being here. And Rick and all you folks, I'm giving two lectures today. The first one, the fact of Marxism in America. The second one, well, that's a sort of a very complicated lecture, get ready. The second one, though, is much more hopeful. It's how to live in a sexually libertine Marxist culture as Christian. So that'll be the second lecture. As we face today, and that was the subject that I was given, what is the world in which we live like today? John Davidson, senior editor at The Federalist, wrote a book, Pagan America, The Decline of Christianity and the Dark Age to Come. So everyone is seeing, not everyone, but many people are seeing the dark ages to come. In the last 15 years, people have left the faith, and that number doubled by 28%. Church attendance has dropped from 40% to 30%. And we are seeing a decline in Christianity. Now, this will not be a political lecture. I've always tried to avoid mere politics, but if I was announcing the gospel in Russia, I'd be obliged to speak about Marxism. And somehow, I'm obliged to have to speak about Marxism in America in the same way. I never thought I'd ever give a lecture on this subject, by the way. I have no intention of defending Christian nationalism, but I've always felt since I came to America that it was important to identify the political and philosophical issues in the culture and how to address them with the Word of God. And I was surprised to note, for instance, that Dr. Michael Brown stated, "The big revelation for me was just how deeply Marxism has impacted our culture." A scholar, Stanley Ridley, makes the startling conclusion, "A Marxist project is guiding American university schools of education." I hope you'll give attention to what I say, doubtless in a grandfatherly manner, but you've become used to listening older gentlemen with a slight case of dementia. That was a joke, folks. That's the only political statement I'll make. Yeah, I never thought I would ever give this lecture in this land that I love, America. For when I came to the States the first time in 1964, by the way, my daughter didn't tell you who this singer was that I knew and grew up with and was a close friend of, but he came to America in '64 as well with three other fellows. His name was John Lennon. You've ever heard of John Lennon? He goes around the world saying, "Have you ever heard of Peter Jones?" But when I came to the States, I was blown away with how Christian America was compared to Europe. In spite of the fact that there are national religions in Europe, America was so Christian in its very life, in its culture, with all the Christian colleges and universities and publishing houses and TV stations and so on, that I was blown away. But as I was here in America in the 60s, I noticed that there was a change taking place called the 60s Revolution. I didn't quite understand how serious it was because I saw all the Christianity in this culture. But eventually I realized and wrote my first book in English on it, The Gnostic Empire Strikes Back. And that was all about the New Age, which I decided was Gnostic, was taking over American culture. But two important sociological books came out, one by Colin Campbell, this one in 2007, The Easternization of the West, where he talks about the process of the Easternization currently occurring in the West, unlike anything previously experienced. So here's a sociologist who's studying Eastern spirituality who says this has never happened before in America. A second scholar by the name of Philip Goldberg, in his book American Veda, that came out in 2010, stated that a large number of Americans had arrived at the worldview of Hinduism, where truth is one. A scholar at Harvard, who was not a believer as such, described what was happening in the 60s as a cultural cataclysmic transformation. She was not a Christian, but she sure saw what was happening, and that was how she described it. What is interesting for us is that Goldberg, in his American Veda, warns us that Hinduism is introducing or has introduced the notion in America of Advaita. Advaita, you'll be surprised to know, means not two. And what are we seeing all the time on the television sets and everywhere else, speaking about the non-dual nature of things against a oneist or a onery nature of things? And so these two notions of dual and non-dual have become part of the way we look at life. And so it's fascinating to see how America has changed at the root of its spirituality. And changing its spirituality is having America change pretty much everything, but in particular, its view of sexuality. In 1960, all 50 states maintained laws criminalizing sodomy. Now, so many say that homosexual relations should be legal and that the lifestyle is acceptable. I've done some study on this whole issue of sexuality, and I think the best term is androgyny, that is the joining of male and female, which you see in homosexuality, in transgenderism as well. You have a person who's claiming to be both male and female at the same time. So androgynous sexuality has come over our culture. And it's part of our great de-churching of America as we adopt what I think we need to describe as a pagan sexuality. To try to convince you that America is becoming Marxist, and by the way, just to include what I just said, I believe that growth of androgynous sexuality is part of the Marxist thinking that we're seeing today. To try to convince you of this fact that America is becoming Marxist, I read the story of Yeonmi Park, a young, good-looking, intelligent woman who escaped North Korea via China and made it finally to America and got herself accepted at Columbia University to do a graduate study program. And this is what this young, intelligent North Korean said about what she was experiencing at Columbia University. Quote, "When I got to Columbia, my jaw dropped because the professors at Columbia University were teaching exactly the same things that my teachers taught me in the Korean classroom." Isn't that amazing? Here's a trained Marxist foreigner who sees this being taught at an Ivy League American university. And unfortunately, she was asked to leave, and when she was asked to give a speech in Texas, the head of diversity called to tell her that she had been canceled because of her political opinions. So in America, in Texas, she was now deplatformed for wanting to lecture on the falsity of Marxism. This happened with another, she was Chinese, this one, Chi Van Fleet, who was an escapee from Maoist China. And at the university in Spokane, Washington, the authorities there voted 9-4 against hosting her to give a speech on the subject. She presented herself as Chinese by birth, American by choice, survivor of Mao's Cultural Revolution, defender of liberty. But she was not allowed to give a lecture at the university in Spokane, Washington. They were fearful that her bringing views to campus, that would be hurtful or offensive. A classic case of deplatforming that is going on in our day when those in power don't like what someone's saying. But I ask the question, have we come to a point where American colleges, or some of them, and the students in them, don't believe the warning people who come from communist countries are able to give them? Are our students so now brainwashed that they will deny the leftism that they will not deny the leftism that they are now being taught? The reason, of course, is that today 82% of faculty are leftists, 82%. 16 are moderate, and 1.4% are conservative. These are the people training our young people, dear friends. And what these people have done is classically what Marxists have always done all over the world, as one Marxist scholar described, the first step of totalitarian Marxism is to erase society's memory and destroy its books, its culture, and its history. So many universities in our time no longer give courses on American history. I couldn't believe that when I discovered it, but it's absolutely true. And I think that that's one of the great dangers of all the millions of immigrants from the South coming into the States. They have no training in what American culture means, and so that they also have no memory of America. Another reason why we should think that Marxism has made its way subtly into America is a book by Howard Zinn, Z-I-N-N, A People's History of the United States. Howard Zinn was a committed Marxist. His book was written as undisguised Marxism, but his book was a major source for students studying history in high school. A major source for studying history in high school. For Zinn, he says, an unworthy culture, which is Christian America, needs to be replaced by something better, namely a classless, egalitarian Marxist society. Well, here you have some indication of why it is not without thinking that we can talk about the coming into this once powerful, free culture, and Christian to boot, that Marxism is here and wants to take over. You know, you can also notice how many of the key influences in politics in our time can be associated with Marxism. One of the interesting books I've read, Imagining Living in a Socialist USA, has an article by an author, Francis Fox Piven. Francis Fox Piven was a mentor to the future President Barack Obama. And he described himself as a community organizer, and that's what she described herself as too. In this book, Imagine Living in a Socialist America, we read, our conception of socialism embraces altering the full range of social, cultural, political, and familial structures and power relationships, all the institutional forces that affect our lives. Now, I don't want to get into a serious discussion of the background of Barack Obama, but since one of our brothers, I think it's you, is at Covenant College, or you were at Grove College, Paul Kengor, a scholar there on Marxism, released a book, The Communist, Frank Marshall Davis, The Untold Story of Barack Obama's Mentor. So this Paul Kengor was a committed Marxist, and he was on file with the FBI as a security risk. And here is a man who brought up the young Barack Obama, whose own father had left him and gone back to Africa. So that's very interesting. Other people that you may know the names of, Valerie Jarrett, head of Barack's cabinet, was a Marxist. John Brennan, of course, whom Obama named as head of the CIA, voted for communists. Angela Davis was a friend of the young the young Obama, and she was a committed Roman Catholic. What was I saying? A committed. I'm getting all these bad things together. A Marxist who studied in Russia. Bill Ayers was a close friend of President Obama, a violent radical Marxist. Van Jones was on his staff as a Marxist. And I recently discovered that Pete DeBourgio, I don't know how to pronounce that name, DeBourgio, who is on the staff of Biden as the Secretary of Transport, had a father who was America's great authority in the study of Gramsci. Who on earth was Gramsci? Gramsci was an Italian Marxist who basically drew up the future of Marxism that we now call Neo-Marxism by eliminating Marxism as a physical opposition to Western culture, and argued that those Marxists who wanted to bring about change ought to change the hegemony of Western culture, that is, those who led the culture with their ideas. So Pete Buttigieg's father empowered that kind of thinking in America among some of these, what we call neo-Marxists. And that is to say, it's the notion of underestimating or pulling down the very notions that hold our culture together in terms of morals and spirituality. I came to understand something of the importance of what was happening when I discovered a book by Christopher Rufo, R-U-F-O. I think you should all read it. America's Cultural Revolution, How the Radical Left Conquered Everything. I'll say it again. America's Cultural Revolution, How the Radical Left Conquered Everything. 2023, quite recent. He attempts to explain the origin of CRT wokeism as the secular heart of neo-Marxist morality. What is at the essence of neo-Marxist morality, he says, is wokeism. Now, you've all heard of wokeism, I'm sure. And this is the attempt to change the culture very subtly in the name of social justice. And of course, we're all keen on social justice, but what on earth is meant by this social justice? Marxists no longer call their earthly redemption communism. They call it social justice. That's according to David Horowitz, whom I often read, who's a Jewish man, who was a radical student rebeller in the 60s and was head of the Ramparts magazine at Berkeley. And over time, he became conservative in his thinking. And this is what he says about the present-day Marxists. They no longer call their movement Marxism, but social justice, which of course is what wokeism talks about. Using, as I said, Antonio Gramsci's theories of how you can bring about Marxist revolution in the West. Gramsci argued that we need a complete secularization of all of life and customary relationships. Homosexuality must be normalized and heterosexuality denormalized. Gramsci's ideas affected some of the influential Neo-Marxists who came up in our time and who came, some of them, to the States. Some of them called the Frankfurt School. And one of them, the well-known Marxist scholar Herbert Marcuse, taught in the University of California in San Diego for many years. And he argued that sexual politics is the basis for the counter-revolution and its transformation. He argued this in his book, Eros and Civilization. So he called for polymorphous sexual practice, that is, anything goes expression of sexuality. So we have here a view of Marxism unlike the one we all knew about, that the workers would join together, create an army, and pull down the Marxist society that they knew, or the non-Marxists on, for that matter, and establish a Marxist culture. Now, of course, Christians can never endorse Marxism since it denies the being of God and sees matter as ultimate. In that text that my daughter Miriam kindly read, Romans 1:25, that's precisely how Paul describes the issues facing us. You either worship creation or you worship the Creator. And of course, Marxists worship creation. And Paul says those are the only two possible ways that we can relate in this world. I called the worship of creation Oneism because it includes everything about life, including matter and all human beings, and we're all one together. And I call the worship of the Creator as twoism because God is separate from us. And therefore, there are two kinds of reality in this world. God, who is totally other than we are, and we who are created. That's twoism, folks. And that's not what Marxism says. Marxism says worship nature, worship matter. Marx actually said that the Gospels were forgeries, and he believed it necessary to recognize as the highest divinity the human self. Now, a more modern form of atheism, what we call CRT, which I think derives from Marxism, shows that that same kind of worship of creation is evident in their choice of postmodern Marxist truth. Postmodernism says there is no truth except the truth we invent. And so you have, of course, the construction of a world based on human notions. That's oneist. So developing an anti-Western cultural view amongst Western intellectuals became the way of installing very subtly in the West Neo-Marxism. Herbert Marcuse was a Marxist, and he was the most influential philosopher figure of the New Left. His doctoral student was Angela Davis, whom I mentioned, a member of the Communist Party. She actually helped found the BLM movement. Angela Davis helped found the Black Lives Matter movement, which has constantly claimed to be Marxist in its influences. And the BLM people said black people deserve a revolution. That's very Marxist, right? Angela Davis hailed the Marxist Marcuse as the intellectual leader of the New Left revolution. Thus, Marcuse is tied to wokeism. How am I doing for time? Not very well. You've had part of what I'm thinking. I would like to say that wokeism is not a new form of Christian justice. But once you speak of justice, Americans with a strict sense of their own identity and spirituality will think that that is good. 56% of American voters believe the term woke to be positive, 39% negative. But this wokeist system has fallen on us in the West somewhat like, as somebody compared it, to the conversion of Constantine, the old emperor of Rome in the 4th century. As a massive cultural conversion, and we have been watching that taking place under our eyes. Across the nation, radical education camps are now routinely held on DEI. Students who attend American universities are obliged to take at least one course on how to focus on DEI. This ideology has also been adopted by some of the massive companies in our culture today, like BlackRock, Vanguard, and State Street. They have more wealth than most countries. And they insist on the people with whom they do business to adopt diversity, equity, and inclusion. So they control most major cities and companies. Truth is relativized because it is postmodern. There is no forgiveness. Whites remain guilty, and blacks are forever victims. I found this statement by a Catholic man who said, "When a black person like me walks into their office looking for a job, just like everyone else, they see me as an object that requires pity instead of a human being who deserves respect. That's the way some black people actually relate to this way of pushing black people forward. Because the goal is ultimately to generate conflict and cultural rebellion. Now, but it's easy to take this as Christian. Social justice, everyone agrees, is an important element. But I was surprised to discover, as I read, the number of non-Christians who call attention to this movement and warn about taking it on. David Harvard, as I mentioned, says social justice is a new form of communism. Barry Weiss, a young journalist in the New York Times, lost her job because she refused to affirm DEI. And she said, it's not about diversity, equity, or inclusion. It's about abrogating power to the movement that threatens America itself and replaces basic ideas of good and evil. Two other scholars that some of you may have read, Helen Pluckrose and James Lindsay, who are self-defining atheists, describe this system as a malicious form of bullying. But some of you perhaps have seen how this functions. Diversity officers in your company run the show, creating an internal revolution, a DEI colonization. And this kind of thinking has taken itself to the very center of our culture. It used to be that the revolutionaries felt themselves on the edges, but now they feel like they are in the center of present culture. I mentioned Stanley Ridley in his book, Brutal Minds. The subtitle of his book is The Dark World of Left-Wing Brainwashing in Our Universities. And he argues that the American university has been taken over with the attempt to destroy it as an institution of knowledge creation, because it seeks to dismantle the pillars of Western society. Here they are, you will recognize them: rationalism, individualism, capitalism, natural rights, the rule of law. All that must go with this new system. And so this Neo-Marxist system is fulfilling the prophecy of Herbert Marcuse, whom I mentioned earlier, who says, if Western society could be ideologically liberated from capitalist repression and the oppressive moral and religious foundations of biblical truth, then the West would collapse and the populace would finally discover true freedom. There you have it. The goal is true freedom. But it's true freedom of all the past of American culture, including Christianity. I was surprised in my much reading, as you can tell, I've done a lot, to discover a book by a black scholar by the name of Manning Johnson, an African-American man who was a first-hand witness to the original attempts to get this kind of thinking going in a book entitled Color, Communism, and Common Sense, published in 1958. Manning Johnson, amazingly, shows that this racism was developed by the Russian communists in 1934 and 35. He shows how Stalin in 1928 developed this idea that we could take over America, so he said, by creating a sense of the evilness of white society in America. And the American communists joined with him in an attempt to advance communism. The goal was to make the white man's system responsible for everything. The Black Rebellion was what Moscow wanted, a bloody racial conflict. Little wonder that Herbert Marcuse, whom I've told you taught in San Diego and was a Marxist, actually called upon the students of the 60s to develop the notion of a new axis for revolution, namely racial conflict. That's what he said they needed to do. Marcuse argued that the only path to liberation was a socialist regime that would produce a godless culture. Now, the 60s revolution, as I mentioned, was also a spiritual revolution. And, oh dear, I've gone over my time. What am I going to do? Rick? I can go to 3. Wonderful. I'll get nowhere near the end. But anyway, I think as I talk about this subject of LGBTQ ideology, we must remember that Christians cannot adopt the notion of moralism, that we are good and they are bad, right? We all know from the doctrine of the fall that we're all bad, and that other sinners need to know that that's our starting position. And so we must avoid contempt for other people. But I must say that this movement, the sexual revolution, is a powerful movement that attempts to take over the culture. I have a page here that I'm not finding. I found it. 10 pages further on, of course. This movement is coming for our children. I want you to notice that. Lesbian author Patricia Nell Warren says, "Whoever captures the kids owns the future." You cannot be cool as to what these people are trying to present in your schools as ideology without realizing the future that this will imply. The San Francisco Gay Men's Chorus sings, "We're coming for your children. We'll convert your children. Happens bit by bit, quietly and subtly, and you'll barely notice it. You won't approve where they go at night." This is indeed where we must take a position. In California, the radicals are trying to introduce into the schools the worship of the South American pagan Aztec gods, and have the kids singing in worship to them without actually stating, which is what I know is the case, that those Aztec gods were involved in human sacrifice and cannibalism. Archaeologists discovered in Mexico City in 2015 a skull tower showing rows and rows of skulls, many of them children. So we will see, as this ideology is being pushed now, not only in terms of sexual practice, but the worship of the gods who were served by homosexual priests, a confrontation with the Christian faith in our world. And we must therefore be aware of what's taking place. I will just point out that we have to be careful about what's happening at the level of sexuality, androgynous sexuality, and its ideology in our culture, okay? But now we have other things. We have abortion, polyamory, pornography, and we are looking at a future that I can describe as a new expression of Sodom and Gomorrah. As we see this powerful ideology taking over and undermining the importance of the family and having children, as we heard, we will see the new expression of a political Sodom and Gomorrah. And by flipping those pages, Rick, I came to the end of my talk. And I want to tell you that this evening it will be the same. I'll keep flipping pages, but I want you to know that what I've told you today is very serious, and we as a church need to take it seriously too. Thank you.
Amen. Thank you, Peter.
You're watching a special presentation of PCRT online. Would you consider helping underwrite the expense of producing this and future conferences? Go to alliancelive.org to make a donation, and as a thank you for your one-time gift of $35 or more, we'll send you the audio from this conference. Again, visit alliancelive.org to make a gift. Thank you.